Hi everyone, my name is Penny and I am a mixed methods researcher from Advanced HE. I am delighted to be presenting to this year's NADP annual conference on what does data tell us about disabled staff and students in UK higher education. In the next few slides, I will present you with some key findings related to disabled staff and students in higher education arising from Advanced HE's latest equality statistical reports. The latest reports are mainly based on HESA data from the 2019-2020 academic year, so just as a content warning, I realise that a lot of the language used by HESA, and thus our reports, when it comes to disabled staff and students, is more closely related to the medical model of disability. So I apologise in advance for that, but would like to clarify that the purpose for which we in Advanced HE use this language when analysing HESA data is to remain consistent and report along the lines of the categories used for data collection purposes. So let's start by looking at disclosure rates. The graph on this slide shows that within the last decade, both student and staff disability disclosure has nearly doubled. For students, the percentage of those disclosing a disability has risen from 8% in 2010-11 to 14.6%. For professional and support services staff, the percentage has risen from 3.6% to 6.5%, and for academic staff from 2.7% to 4.6%. As becomes clear, disability disclosure rates vary significantly between the different populations in UK higher education, with the amount of students disclosing as disabled being almost twice that of staff. The proportion of academic staff members disclosing as disabled keeps on being the lowest of all compared to students and professional and support staff, and I hope that throughout this conference we will question and explore why this might be the case. Disability disclosure rates vary across students in different degree levels as well. Specifically, the higher up we move in degree levels, the lower the proportion of students disclosing a disability. The only exemption to this trend is between taught and research postgraduate students, where 11% of PhD students disclosed a disability, compared to just below 10% of master students. 16.4% of first degree undergraduate students disclosed a disability, and 12.7% of students in other undergraduate degrees. Moreover, the student staff disability pipeline is telling, as the gap in the proportion of disability disclosure in each step of the way from first degree undergraduates to professors increases. The proportion of disabled first degree undergraduate students is 5 times bigger than the proportion of disabled professors. Specifically, as the graph in this slide shows, although almost 1 in 6 undergraduate students is disabled, only 1 in 30 professors is disabled. The next few slides focus on disability student allowance claims. Among disabled students with a known DSA status, 32.7% received disability students allowance in 2019-20, which represents a decrease of 1.3 percentage points compared to 2018-19, and is almost 14 percentage points lower than the peak noted in 2009-2010. Disability allowance take-up varies significantly by students' impairment type, with students disclosing specific learning difficulties forming the biggest proportion of those in receipt of the allowance at 43.6%. Students disclosing a mental health condition are far behind in the second place, forming just above 18% of the recipients, with students declaring multiple conditions in the third place, forming 16% of the DSA recipients. Disability allowance take-up also varies across degree levels. The biggest proportion of the allowance recipients are first degree undergraduates, making up a third of the recipients, followed by master students who make up nearly a quarter of the recipients. Almost 22% of the DSA recipients are research postgraduate students, and nearly 16.5% of the recipients are students from other undergraduate degrees. Let's now focus on the difference between the overall disclosure rates of academic staff members and those of professors. As the present graph shows, disability disclosure varies among academic staff at different levels, with the rate of disability disclosure by professors increasing slower than that of academic staff members within the last decade. Moreover, still the proportion of professors that disclose as disabled is lower than the proportion of disabled academic staff. This is 3.2% for professors compared to 4.6% for academic staff in general. Focusing again on professors, within the last decade, the proportion of disabled academics who are professors decreased by 0.4 percentage points, from 7.5% to 7.1%, whereas the proportion of non-disabled staff who are professors increased by 1.6 percentage points, from 8.0% to 10.4%. This means that although the initial difference between the proportion of disabled and non-disabled staff who are professors was at 1.3 percentage points, this grew even bigger and has now reached a 3.3 percentage point difference. This graph presents the most common impairment types disclosed among students and staff members declaring a disability. We see that these vary across the two populations, with long-lasting illness or health condition being the impairment type mostly disclosed by staff members at 23.8%, whereas specific learning difficulties are the most disclosed impairment type among students at 33.4%. It is worth mentioning that the share of both staff and students who disclose the mental health condition has risen since last year, which might be related to COVID and its well-documented severe effects on well-being. Nearly twice as many female academic staff members disclose a mental health condition as male academics, with 65.3% of female academics disclosing one, compared to 34.7% of male academics. This is an example of how an intersectional approach might shed light on disability issues. It is also worth considering how this difference might relate to gender inequities faced by female academics, who, for example, tend to be employed in more precarious contracts, are less well paid compared to their male colleagues, and have to balance their work alongside caring responsibilities more frequently. Looking at academic staff member salaries, this slide shows that a lower proportion of disabled academics are on the highest baseline compared to non-disabled academics. Being exact, while 36.6% of non-disabled academics earn over than £50,000 per year, only 32% of disabled academics do so. This inequity in terms of salaries is not only a feature noted among academic staff members. On the contrary, there is a disability paying gap for all UK higher education staff members when looking at the salaries of academic and professional and support staff combined. As this slide shows, the disability paying gap has mainly been increasing within the last 5 years. Specifically, whereas on average non-disabled staff members earn 7.7% more than their disabled colleagues in 2015-2016, this gap has risen even further, with non-disabled staff members in 2019-2020 earning on average nearly 9.5% more than their disabled colleagues. Finally, looking at the disability awarding gap, this has reduced more so within the last year than in the past. Specifically, whereas between 2010-11 and 2018-19, the awarding gap between non-disabled and disabled qualifiers was in average at around 1.9 percentage points. In 2019-20, this was only at 0.6 percentage points, with 82.2 of first-degree non-disabled qualifiers and 81.6% of disabled qualifiers being awarded with a first or a 2-1 degree. It is important to question why this might have happened and try to interrogate what might have happened within the last year that was different to the previous ones. Thinking, for example, about the non-detriment policies and remote assessment practices adopted by institutions due to COVID, and how this might have impacted disabled students' attainment. Closing the disability awarding gap is important because degree awards are closely linked to career outcomes. HISA's data indeed show that there is a disability gap in graduate outcomes, as more disabled students who qualified in 2018-19 were unemployed than their non-disabled peers, with 8% compared to 6.2% respectively, and a smaller share were in full-time work, with 20.4% compared to 18.9% respectively. So that brings me to the end of my whistle-stop tour of our key disability-related findings from our annual Staff and Student Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statistical Reports.